You're listening to Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we explore ideas and techniques that help you break down partisan barriers, build rapport across the aisle, and make a more persuasive case for the Second Amendment. I'm John Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Cade. Today we're guests in the studio of Bryan Strawser, who will be talking to us about mass killings. We'll take a look at what both sides get wrong about this topic and explore constructive ways to move the debate forward. Bryan, thanks for talking to us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Bryan Strawser, and I hold a number of roles, although I think we're going to focus on my professional role as we talk today. But let's just get out of the way. I'm chairman of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, PAC, and our support fund. So I'm a gun rights activist and have been for over a decade. That's a volunteer role that I have. But I'm not here generally in that capacity today. But professionally, I've spent almost 3 decades in global security with a large Fortune 30 organization for 21 years, and the last 5 as a consultant. I'm CEO of a consulting firm, and dealing with active shooter situations and other targeted acts of violence, workplace violence, school violence. Threat assessment is a big part of what our practice is. To kind of emphasize on that, undergraduate degree in criminal justice, worked in law enforcement prior to a private sector career, have an MBA, graduated from Harvard's National Preparedness Leadership Program, and I'm a senior fellow at Auburn University in the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, where my focus is on public-private sector collaboration and interaction on national security and cybersecurity issues. And I've actually worked on this issue with some federal agencies back 3 years ago, more on the how do you deal with a significant incident where the private sector may have involvement or evidence or response that helps with that situation. And because I don't have enough schooling, I'm a postgraduate student in the Department of War Studies at King's College.
So this is right in your wheelhouse then.
We do a lot of this type of work. I think more about just preparing organizations, companies, large organizations to deal with workplace violence and threats of targeted violence and active shooter situations, everything from planning, training, exercising, and then helping them kind of mature around this. And just relevant to this discussion, in my former corporate life, I spent 6 years leading the global crisis management capability for one of the largest companies in the United States, where we dealt with on a regular basis these kind of things we're going to talk about today. We had workplace violence threats on a near daily basis. We had successful targeted violence attacks where individuals were killed. And I had a significant active shooter situation in a corporate headquarters environment in downtown Minneapolis that was literally across the street from the building I was standing in. Although I was in class when it started. I wasn't in class for very long that day. That was 7 years ago. Fortunately, no one was killed. And everything we know about mass shootings in conventional wisdom is wrong.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to touch on, or at least cover in this conversation, is the difference between the realities of this problem compared to how present it feels in our lives and how much our perception of the risk prioritizes incidents like mass shooting over other things that are more likely or more preventable.
Gallup just had a poll out Thursday last week, not specifically on this topic, but that Americans' perception of the crime rate and the violent crime rate in the United States was significantly higher than the reality of what the violent crime rate is in the United States, which is at a near 50-year low, despite a couple of hiccups, 2014 to 2017.
Yeah, it's like
we're back down.
What Steven Pinker's been talking about lately, where everything's amazing and no one seems to notice.
Right. Yeah, Pinker's view on this is awesome. I have his book down the hall.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the things that dominate the headlines dominate our attention, and it kind of distorts the perception of risk.
Yeah, I mean, the media doesn't, I know we're going to talk about the media, but the media doesn't do a very good job of putting this information in context because Americans typically just don't have the attention span to see that and aren't willing in a lot of cases to listen. I think also the rise of just the politicalization of the issue between, to some extent, left-right, but more, I would say, kind of pro-gun rights versus anti-gun rights, or however you want to characterize the two sides. I think the propaganda around the issue is what distorts this sometimes, because it's hard to know what's really true and if things are being put in context or not.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think that people naturally, in their own minds, conflate the degree to which they're morally outraged by an incident. They transcribe that over to the size of the problem. So if you have a big feeling about a problem, the problem must be big too.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think there's also in this country, we like narratives, right? I mean, things are successful when there's a catchy narrative attached to it. And I think we're more common as Americans to look at a single tragic incident and the narrative surrounding that incident and form our opinions about public policy from that incident, which is generally a really bad way to make public policy. But no, we're kind of off track of where we want to go. So
yeah,
get back to that.
Just to take it back a little bit. So to start with, how do we define or categorize the problem of mass killing? Like, is there terminology we should be using? Like, how do we talk about this in a way that we can kind of come together on it?
Well, there's no actual definition for mass killing or mass shooting, however you want to say that. And I typically say mass shooting, so forgive me if I use that narrative or that term as we go through this. Generally, the Congressional Research Service and the FBI have stuck with the definition, although they've never come out and said this is the definition we're using, that 4 or more killed in a single criminal incident within 24 hours is a mass killing or mass shooting. When we talk about some of the data today from the FBI and the United States Secret Service, that's the definition that they're operating off of. But the Gun Violence Archive, which is what the other side of the issue often uses as their source for this, and this is a nonprofit organization that gathers news about mass shootings, they have a very different definition, which under their definition, we've had hundreds of mass shooting incidents this year. Under the FBI's definition, we've had like 7.
Yeah, I've noticed that discrepancy too. And I've heard a lot of arguments from the generally gun control side of the aisle that this is a crisis. We've had hundreds of these incidents, and it's kind of hard to know what to really think about that or how to interpret that.
Mm-hmm. I would say that most of the academic studies, and I'm going to talk about one that came out last night from 2 local authors at Hamline and Metro State Universities, that they use the FBI's definition. Mm-hmm. And that's the definition that they built their database and have reached their findings using that data. So I tend to lean that direction, that that's the better definition to use. But I think anytime the conversation comes up, it's like any other thing that we argue, or any other fact-based thing that I argue in my job or in my academic career is, well, what is the definition that we're operating off of? And are we speaking the same language?
Yeah, and
we're not.
One of the problems with the expansive definition, where the statistics may be inflated to match the emotional perception of the problem, is that you wind up including so many different kinds of incidents that you stop talking about the same problem, and you've actually wound up making not only the problem seem larger,
correct,
but you've made it infinitely more complex because you have a larger variety of different kinds of incidents bundled together, each of which has their own root causes involved in it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, you lose the ability to look at the unique nature of a mass killing, a mass shooting incident, and see if we can draw any conclusions from that we can use to disrupt things prior to the actual act of targeted violence. So the definition matters a lot, and it's hard not to think that sometimes that definition is manipulated for reasons.
Yeah, it's a little like the problem of conflating suicides with murder and then using that inflated statistic to argue against guns in general, when the problem itself is actually way more specific than that.
Right. I mean, I think we saw last year, and I expect we'll see it again when they make their 2020 report, that one of the local anti-gun or gun violence prevention groups, pick your definition, they included suicide in their analysis of stand your ground laws. Oh. But stand your ground laws have nothing to do with suicide. It has nothing to do with the access to lethal means. That's one of the biggest risk factors in suicide and self-harm, is the access to the means to carry out the plan.
Right. Like, are you conflating incidences of people cutting themselves as like a like a psychological self-mutilation? Are you conflating that with assault statistics? Because if you're not, then you should keep your suicide and interpersonal violence statistics separate, because otherwise we'll never solve the problem.
Yeah, and that is the goal. And I think generally both sides come to this with goodwill and good intentions, but sometimes they get a little carried away with manipulation of the data.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that.
How would you address the claims that mass killings or mass shootings are a new normal, and is it realistic to expect this to stop anytime soon?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, we can look at the data. And so let's talk a little bit about that and then see if we can get to a conclusion here. Mass shootings account for 0.2% of firearm homicides in the United States. And that's if we exclude the Las Vegas shooting, which was of a scale that was just highly unusual in the history of mass shootings. But 0.2% in a typical year. But they're very focusing events, meaning they gather a lot of media attention. They gather a lot of politicians kind of circling around the incident, talking about solutions that maybe should be pursued. So they're very statistically rare, but most people in the United States think of them as routine because we put such media emphasis on what has happened in this single incident. Interestingly enough, and I didn't know this until I read this recent study, the first mass shooting was in August 1903. Was committed by a veteran with a revolver who killed 9 and wounded 25 and then took his own life. I had not heard that story. But they're mass shootings, mass killings, they're very extreme and rare events. It's been difficult to study them because if we follow this definition, the FBI's definition, they're a statistically rare, infrequently observed phenomenon that it's difficult to have enough of them to understand what's happened here and what can we glean from the data around the incident. But that said, they are becoming more frequent and they are becoming deadlier. The data shows there's been, in the past 50 years, there's 167 mass shooting events using that definition. 20% of them have occurred in the last 5 years and half of them have occurred in the last 20 years. So there's definitely been an increase in frequency of the events and they're more lethal than they have been before. And that's just what the data shows. By the way, they most commonly happen in workplaces, 28% of the time. Restaurant, bars, and nightclubs, 14% of the time. Retail, 13% of the time. Churches, 6.4% of the time. They happen less frequently in schools and college and university environments or in public locations. So will they end? I don't think so. But they're definitely becoming more frequent.
I think part of this problem, and it's kind of difficult to talk about, but we're just going to kind of put this out there regardless of how it might sound. But I think one thing to talk about here is the pace of human innovation. We've seen leaps and bounds in human innovation in every other category that we look at, whether it's medicine or science or anything that we look at. And so it seems to be that's pretty natural that you'd also see human innovation in the area of mass murder as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to talk about this, I think, when we talk about the whys or the motivations and others. But, well, the data shows that part of the increase in frequency, as this study that came out yesterday shows, is they've gone and interviewed mass shooters who have survived the incident. Fame has been the most increased area of motivation for them. They want the copycat experience, and many of them have studied previous mass shooting incidents. Columbine in particular seems to be of interesting fascination for them as they seek to make their plans. Yeah,
I've been thinking about this in terms of like mimetic contagion or like social contagion. I mean, we've seen this in other instances and have looked at it with certain kinds of curiosity, like a rock star in Japan kills themselves and then scores of fans proceed. There's That's like a contagious effect of the suicide. And in some ways, it's weirdly perverse to discuss it in terms of innovation because we're used to associating innovation with positive connotations.
Right.
But Columbine, I think, was kind of reversely innovative, like darkly innovative in that it had the really strong attention capturing effect. There was surveillance footage. There was heavy media coverage. There was, personal manifestos involved. And it kind of set the paradigm for what people could expect to accomplish. And it innovated a potential course of action where that might not have been obvious to people before. So now when people get upset, there's this other door that they can walk through, which is go do something heinous that's going to get a lot of attention.
Yeah, I mean, there's the media coverage in Columbine, and I remember this well. The media coverage in Columbine, a lot of it was focused on the two shooters. And the, I forget, it was the sister or friend that did the straw purchase on at least one of the firearms in that case. The media attention was focused on the attackers instead of on the survivors and the victims of that, or on the police response, which, by the way, that was probably a bigger story to tell. Columbine was revolutionary for law enforcement tactics in these situations because in Columbine, they set a perimeter and waited for a SWAT team to arrive. And that cost lives, as opposed to go in and confront the shooter with lethal force, which the FBI data shows that's the fastest way to end the killing, is to do that. So I think the media focused on the wrong thing in Columbine, and that drove some of this attention-seeking, fame-seeking behavior that we've seen in attacks since 1999.
Yeah, CNN had a literal leaderboard, like an actual leaderboard. And it's hard not to think of how that could affect.
Like, do you really want to have a leaderboard
Yeah.
for a generation of people who have grown up looking at high scores?
Right.
Right.
That's insane. I remember this conversation in 2011. I was at a FEMA DHS conference out of Colorado Springs at U.S. Northern Command, and the mayor of the city in Norway, where, that's that is the biggest mass killing, I think, in world history. That individual that went and killed a lot of youth on an island. So the mayor of that city came and spoke with us about, his focus was really about how do you recover from such a tragic incident when you're in a relatively small city as an elected official. But I thought that the most compelling thing that he talked about, it was the first time I had heard about not giving the shooter notoriety. And he really made a compelling story about why I don't speak his name. I don't talk about him and his beliefs. I don't talk about what he did. I talk about the victims and what we lost. And I talk about how the city was resilient and grew past that. But what stuck with me out of that, which we now, I think the media's starting to follow this, which is we're not going to give notoriety to the shooter because the data shows that that's one of the factors, one of the motivating factors in future mass killers.
Right. And we learned this lesson about serial killers.
Right.
And something that I've been noticing and wondering if there's anything mathematical to back this up, but I realized that I hadn't heard lately about serial killers in the news. And that used to be a much more prevalent thing. And I looked it up to see what the stats were on serial killers who've been arrested lately. And all of the serial killers who have been, that I could find just from a cursory glance, who have been arrested in the past 10 or 20 years were all born in the 60s and 70s with almost no exceptions. So I think the serial killing used to be a meme, which has kind of run its course, at least in terms of our attention span. And maybe the people who would have been serial killers 20 years ago are choosing a different path and doing all their killing all at once for the same kind of attention, if that makes any sense.
No, you may be right. I don't, I haven't followed serial killers for a while, but I was, when was I there? 2013.
They both get fan mail, interestingly
They both get fan mail. Well, the guy in Norway gets a lot of fan mail.
Yeah.
And has corresponded with individuals who have gone on to commit mass shootings.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's and I forget which case that was recently. I want to say it was Dayton or El Paso that happened, but I may be wrong.
New Zealand, maybe?
The facts. It could have been. No, you're right. It was the New Zealand shooter. Yeah, you're correct.
Wow.
Yeah, like I said, I don't remember the specifics.
So in the aftermath of these incidents, everyone kind of wants to know what motivated these killers. But how much does the why really matter, and how can it inform the solutions?
Well, I think the why, this is the question everyone always asks, and I think it's not necessarily the right question, because the why, we want to know that because that's how we are as humans. Like, why would someone do this? We can't fathom doing this, right? So they must be mentally ill or something has caused them to snap, and neither of those is really true. The why is an important question, I think, after, but I don't think the why helps you figure out what pathway are these folks on, and how do I disrupt that before they get to the actual act of violence. But here's what the data leads to. And I think we'll talk at the end about, some of the data I'm citing. But as far as motivation goes, and these numbers won't add up to 100% because folks may have multiple motivations. About 22% had interpersonal conflict with an individual that they were targeting in the mass shooting. About 21% were motivated by an employment issue. About 16%, the mass shooting was triggered by what we call domestic spillage, or it's a domestic violence incident that comes over to a public place because that's where the killer can get access to his or her intended victim. I may as well say his, because almost every mass killing is committed by a male. 90% of violent crime is driven by males, but 98% of mass shootings have been committed by men. 16% about 16% have a genuine psychosis. They're having a psychological break of some type that has created a mental health crisis for them. And about 11% have some kind of relationship issue. And if you get beyond, those were just like what motivated you. This is from the study that was just released yesterday. But if you get beyond that, there's really not a single factor you can look at and go, aha, that person is a potential mass shooter. It's a combination of factors. And it's almost impossible to say, this combination of factors applied to that person is going to indicate to us that they're a potential mass shooter. We might be able to identify violent or threatening behavior. We might be able to identify violent crime that they've committed in the past. We might be able to say, hey, this person has an actual mental health issue that we should, dive into. But for example, the FBI study on pre-attack indicators of active shooters. So they went back and looked at 13 years of active shooter cases and said, what was there that could have been observed? 62% had a mental health challenge. 49% had financial stress. 35% had job stress. 29% had conflict with friends or peers. 27% had marital problems. 22% had abuse of illicit drugs or alcohol. And it goes on.
Don't these all sound kind of like totally mundane features of everyone's life?
Often, yeah. I mean, for example, mental illness comes up a lot when it comes to mass killing. But we know that the vast majority of people who suffer from an identified diagnosed mental illness are not violent. In fact, they're more likely to be the victim of violent crime. About 68% of mass shooters had some kind of history of mental health issues, and that seems pretty striking until you realize that 50% of the population of this country will at some point in their lifetime be diagnosed or have some type of mental health challenge. So they're not, is it higher than normal? Yes. Is it significantly higher than the general population? Not really. 19% of mass shooters were hospitalized for psychiatric reasons. 25% sought mental health counseling. 20% were on psychotropic medication. Yet 20% of those diagnosed with mental health issues in the United States are on psychotropic medication. So the rate is consistent with that of the general population.
It seems like something that's so normal would be hard to really tease apart and figure out what causes the actual risk.
I don't know. Well, that's a different question. Mm-hmm. What has caused this to happen? And I don't think we know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. I do think that there are things in the data, multiple studies now between the FBI's report and the report out of the Violence Project here in the Twin Cities that was released yesterday, I think points to, well, there are things that we can see in advance that would indicate that this person is on a pathway to commit an act of violence or is at greater risk to commit an act of violence. And we don't do a very good job of realizing that those things are there. For example, 48% of the mass shootings that were studied in this report from yesterday had leakage. They leaked their plans in advance. They spoke about their plans. They spoke about wanting to commit violence in not in a, an actual threat is one that's not preconditioned on something, right? If I say, well, if you don't give me my job back, I'm going to shoot you. Well, that's not much of a severe threat because if you're preconditioning it, you're less likely to do it. But if I tell you I'm going to shoot you after work today, that's a threat. It's specific and actionable, and there's no precondition.
The kid who shot up the school in California the other day posted to social media some kind of like vague threat before he went to school.
Yeah. Do you know the wording of the threat, or just that it was kind of vague?
It was, I think he posted a screenshot of the New Zealand shooting and said, have fun at school today or see you at school or something like that.
See, I wouldn't take that as I realize it's vague. I would take that as a threat that we would need to react to immediately.
Yeah.
But this is what I do for a living. Most folks are not going to see it that way.
And how do you do something? How do you react to that without closely monitoring the social media of every student at school?
Yeah, I mean, that is a massive challenge. And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. In terms of government or school or some other organization monitoring such things. Because, I mean, for God's sake, how many Facebook accounts are there? There's like 1.2 billion in the world or something insane. How do you track that? And by the way, you can't track that unless Facebook gives you access to everything, which they won't do that. But what the data does show is that people do notice these things. So maybe the individual posted this on social media. They likely have social media connections that saw that and didn't react, didn't report, didn't address or deal with that.
So while you were saying that, I was kind of thinking, well, maybe the answer is the see something, say something, Like if you see something, report it. But then I thought, all right, well, how do you separate that out from statistical noise? Like, are you just creating more statistical noise? Because there's also a little bit of a movement right now with the political polarization that anything you don't like must be threatening.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a Democratic activist in northern Minnesota up on the Iron Range who I interact with on Twitter, who I realize in person is a rational and thinking human being. We just don't agree politically. But he made a post back at the time of the El Paso and Dayton shootings that Anybody he sees post anything involving firearms, he's calling and reporting it to the FBI. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
You're adding to the amount of crap that a law enforcement agency has to sort through to get to the actual threat. Mm-hmm. A guy posting a picture of shooting a deer this week with an AR-15 platform rifle is not a threat unless he's doing something else that makes that a threat. So you're adding something that a federal agency is going to have to go investigate. Don't do that.
Here's another thing to consider. So we say, well, they're posting to social media. Someone in their life must have seen it. Right. Someone who social media actively filters what you see. And I'm not talking about like a bias. I'm saying that the people you interact with the least are the least likely to show up in your feeds. And the people you have the most interactions with are going to get their posts are going to get served to you on a more frequent basis. So someone who may be more likely to commit one of these kinds of attacks also might be the kind of person who doesn't necessarily have consistently positive or frequent social interactions with the people at their workplace or school. So they might be less likely they might post that in the morning and someone won't see that post for another 5 hours. Mm-hmm. Like if I don't have the right kinds of communications and posting and social media habits, I'll see something that my own mother posted several hours after she posted it.
Right.
So there's no guarantee that, even if you could monitor social media closely for signs of leakage from people in your school or workplace, there's no guarantee that you'll see it before the start of business or the start of school.
Right. Yeah. I would completely agree with that. I think, the FBI's study on pre-attack indicators, it's interesting to note, who noticed concerning behaviors prior to an act of violence. 92% of classmates of a student who committed an act of violence, committed an active shooter mass killing incident, noticed the concerning behaviors. 87% of spouses or domestic partners, if they were in a relationship, 75% of students, or 75% teachers or school staff noticed. 68% family members, 51% friends, 40% coworkers. So I think there is an opportunity to help folks understand like what makes up concerning or threatening behaviors and what actions that they should take. And I don't think that to be overly complicated. And there's a lot of factors you could look at around this. I think we're going to talk about some solutions in a bit. So I'll save that for then.
Okay. So you're talking about like something a layperson could, some knowledge a layperson could use to help separate this danger from the noise.
Yeah. And as long as we're talking about, not teachers, staff, faculty, management, HR, security in a workplace, those folks, I would go beyond layperson. They need to be properly trained on how to assess behavior, and there needs to be reporting mechanisms within their organizations to provide for that. But that's another discussion.
Yeah, that's what I dislike about red flag laws is that any layperson can bring a total non-diagnosis to a judge and have it enforced with the force of law.
Right.
So we were talking about warning signs and factors that mass shooters have in common.
Yeah. So let me throw just a couple other things. One big myth, he just snapped. He just snapped. And that I'm here to tell you that doesn't happen. There is always leakage. Well, not always, but almost always there's leakage. There's warning signs. There's previous criminal behavior. There's observable behavior, particularly with students where they don't have the maturity yet to hide some of these things that are going on. Nobody just snaps. You will find this out about the school shooting last week in California. When we go back, we're going to find out that, as you already did, there were social media posts, and there'll be more to that. There's usually 3 or 4 factors that are present. I should also point out one relatively scary statistic here is that 70% of mass shooters knew at least some of their victims. And in some cases, they were a student attacking other students. So all of the physical security things we're doing in schools won't matter because they can bypass it, because they will already have access. And the same applies in the workplace. They almost always already have access. And if they commit their act before they're terminated, before their access is revoked, or before they're expelled or sent to treatment or whatever, then none of those things matter because they can get in.
So that sounds like something both sides tend to get wrong about this phenomenon, that you can just harden the school or harden the workplace and that would stop these things.
Yeah, no single solution, I think, solves this issue. It has to be a multi-pronged issue. There were kind of 4 conclusions from the report that came out yesterday. Like, what are the 4 things mass shooters have in common? And although this doesn't apply in every case, there are 4 things that stand out statistically. And that is early childhood trauma and exposure to violence at a young age. And we don't mean violent video games or television. We mean real violence, domestic violence, bullying, those kind of things that might happen. Some kind of identifiable grievance or crisis point. This can be a psychiatric break. It could be that, as we talked about, there's a triggering event. There's a domestic violence issue. There's a relationship challenge. There's a work challenge. They seek some kind of validation for their beliefs. This is where studying past shootings is usually the observable behavior. And then access to the means to carry out the attack. That they have access to lethal means that enable them to do what they plan to do as a part of the attack. So there's areas where we need better tools and better ways to intervene in those 4 areas.
Is there anything else you think both sides get wrong about this phenomenon?
Well, I think most people get most things wrong about this. A couple things that come to mind is and we talked about mental illness already. I won't repeat that piece, but violent video games comes up a lot. And there's absolutely zero correlation between violent video games and mass shootings.
So they're not conditioning our children to kill.
Not at all. Could you make an argument that maybe that has some minor impact? Sure, but there's no data that supports any of that. I've played violent video games since I was 8. I think whenever the Bard's Tale came out in the 80s, we were killing people with the ice horn in the streets of whatever the town was called. There's no connectivity there at all. And I know it's a nice thing to point a finger at, but it doesn't really correlate to anything. We talk about guns, and I know we're trying to avoid the political piece, but guns don't cause people to commit mass killing. But I think we need to be fair about this, that access to lethal means is a definite risk factor for people who make plans to commit suicide, inflict self-harm, or carry out a mass killing. So those are the people that we want to disrupt their ability to access those lethal means. The answer to that, I'm not sure. I don't support red flag laws as they are today. Is it assault weapons? And I'm doing air quotes here. Assault weapons. 77% of mass shootings were committed using handguns. By the way, these numbers I'm about to say, they won't add up to 100% because people use multiple firearms. But 77% were committed with handguns. 25% were using a assault weapon, air quotes. 23% other types of rifles. 22% shotguns. So as the study yesterday, published last night, shows or mentions, ban assault weapons, ban high-capacity magazines, and you've done nothing to solve the issue or reduce lethality because 77% of these are carried out with handguns. And most of them have less than 10 victims. So if you're going to do a 10-round magazine limit and you're going to ban rifles, assault rifles, air quotes, no impact.
I also saw an older study about that said that in the average incident, the time between victims is greater than the time it takes to reload anyway. So even magazine bans really aren't going to help.
Right. I think there's, I think you're referring to Cofer's DOJ funded study after the ban expired in 2004. And Cofer made that point. The magazine capacity doesn't matter because of the time factor here. And even the most recent FBI, the 2013 FBI active shooter study, the amount of time that the killer has to do their mass killing prior to a law enforcement response or an armed civilian response is high enough that it wouldn't matter. But nobody wants to hear that.
Additionally, we're discussing a number of events and a number of deaths that even if you were to institute a ban on any piece of technology, the normal rate of difference between how many events occur each year, you wouldn't necessarily be able to detect if your ban had any effect or not.
Yeah, there's not a statistically significant number of events in the course of a year to know. The other thing that we talk about are background checks, universal background checks with mass shootings. And again, these numbers won't add up to 100% because we've got multiple firearms involved. But 77% purchased at least one of their firearms through legal means, meaning they went through the federal and state-specific background check process to obtain their firearm. 13% made an illegal purchase, a straw purchase, or they bought it off the black market because they were prohibited. 19% just up and up stole their firearms. And by the way, for students who kill in schools, stealing the parent's firearm is the number one way in which they obtain, I shouldn't just say parents, grandparents, or other firearms they may have access to that are legally owned. They're stealing them in order to commit their act of violence because they can't go to a store. They're underage. And even if we raise the age to 21, which California did, it doesn't keep you from stealing the firearm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then on top of it, even if background checks were expanded, background checks are background checks. They only tell you what have happened in the past, and they don't have any predictive mechanism attached to them.
Right. Yeah, there are some states where there's more discretion given to law enforcement to deny firearm purchases. Like I lived in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and you had to have a permit from your police chief to buy anything. And the chief could deny you for essentially any reason that came to mind, and court review was relatively limited. For example, my chief in my first town didn't allow you to own a handgun that could accept a magazine that held more than 10 rounds.
So like almost
pretty much every handgun.
Useful.
Insta
handgun.
felony, go to jail for 5 years.
That's
go to prison for 5 years. I owned it anyway. But they can choose what to issue and what not to. So they have more discretion to deny folks that they think are a danger to themselves or others. But I don't think that really does anything in this case. And
it's pretty usual to see may issue contexts be kind of subject to some significant amount of abuse from either abuse or capriciousness from whatever law enforcement is overseeing them.
Yeah, I mean, Massachusetts is a good example of this. Everywhere in Massachusetts, no matter where you live, you're in a city. That city is in a county, but the county sheriff's job is to serve orders of the court, protect the court, and run the jail. So you deal with your local police chief on any of this permit stuff. And who picks the police chief? Well, the mayor and the city council do. And so there's definitely political expediency. And the state is mostly pretty far to the left.
Yeah. And then I think whatever your position is on guns, I think it's pretty easy to get some agreement that you don't want your rights to be subjected to someone who's unelected.
Right.
Like that's not American, no matter what we're talking about.
Completely concur with that.
So just to kind of bring it back a little bit to school shootings. You talked a little bit about that already, but how common are they really?
They're exceptionally rare. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed in a school shooting. If you are worried about your children's safety when it comes to, being at school, your biggest concern should be in the process of getting them to school and getting them home from school, because that's where most school fatalities and injuries occur. The Secret Service has a report out last week on their multi-year study. I think it's 2007 to 2016 or 2015 on targeted school violence. It's a brilliant analysis. And I know a lot of people are like, why is the Secret Service studying school shootings? They actually have a congressional mandate to do this, and it came out of Columbine because someone got the idea the Secret Service might know something about threat assessment and threat management
right.
because they do that for all of the protectees like the President of the United States. So they have a lot of expertise, and their behavioral unit is top notch, and so is the bureaus. But school shootings, again, as we talked about, they're almost always students of the school. So the physical security measures can't be the whole story. It's got to be part of a broader set of solutions. And the Secret Service strongly recommends K through 12 schools implement a threat assessment team centered process. And there is legislation to assist with this that's pending before Congress. It's the TAPS Act. And it basically forms a council reporting to the DHS secretary who will set a national standard for how this should work. I'm a member of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and this is a bill that our organization helped craft. The threat assessment teams, multidisciplinary groups that look at threats, follow successful methodology, and then craft plans to help that student get access to the help that they need, but also put the right safety and security mitigation things in place for the school and for other students. So they're very successful. They don't stop everything, but they do help.
Yeah, that seems a much better strategy to me, where you're actually targeting behavior, you're targeting like a demonstrated risk, rather than just hoping to cast a wide enough net that you might happen to catch someone by accident.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, we've talked about this in other episodes. If you're looking for a needle in a haystack, you don't address it at the haystack level. You address it at the needle creation level.
Right. I'm looking for that behavior that stands out. So I've been involved in threat assessment processes in companies of a company with 400,000 employees globally. There were a number of threats. There were a number of unwarranted reports, but you figure that out pretty quickly in the assessment process of, well, this is somebody who's making a false report. So now we're going to deal with that. It's a disciplinary problem. Otherwise, yeah, this is a threat of domestic violence was a common one. So we're going to put the things in place to make sure that the facility and the individual is protected. And we'll work with law enforcement and others to make that happen.
So what do you think both sides get right about this issue, if anything?
I'm not sure that we do. There's not agreement on basic facts around this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's unfortunate. There are facts that I think favor the general position of both sides in some cases. The truth of how to best address that is somewhere in the middle. But I think we get lost on the factual argument. As Americans, I think we have this tendency to just oversimplify everything. Like, what's the soundbite that tells the story? And, we're on to about 50 minutes of talking here, and we're only through about 3/4 of the story, and you could spend all day, talking about this issue. Oversimplification example, just briefly, because it's a passionate topic, is arming school staff. Okay, so there's two sides to this. Some folks don't want to be armed. Okay, so you exclude them. We have parents who don't want to have armed staff around, but yet more than half the schools in the United States have police that are assigned to them on a full-time basis. The efficacy of that is kind of up in the air. I think less because of the presence and more because of what that individual does when something happens. But then you look at Santa Clarita last week, the school shooting in California. There were 3, it looks like, off-duty officers who were somewhere in or near the drop-off line with their kids and who responded to that shooting within seconds. So again, we know from the FBI data, the faster the shooter's confronted with force, the sooner the incident ends and the killing stops. So I think we oversimplify the arming teachers question around, do you arm staff? Do you put armed staff in the facility or not? Do you put police in the facility or not? We don't argue in good faith around that. So therefore we get lost in the whole argument about oversimplifying yes or oversimplifying no. In that case, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of nuance there that we're kind of missing in our haste to push our personal agendas.
Mm-hmm. And then I think politically, the facts just don't matter, right? It doesn't matter. I don't think there's an educational effort that tilts the balance of power in the legislature around this issue. It is about getting people out to vote and electing the legislature that agrees with you, because testimony in Congress or in the Minnesota legislature, and Sarah, you've testified as well as I have, it's kabuki theater.
Oh, yeah.
Right? The vote's predetermined based upon the partisan split of the committee. It's a little different on the floor because we have some different alliances there that come into play based on geography and the political beliefs of that geography. But testimony doesn't lead us to a better answer. We could share all of this data in testimony and it would be ignored by either side. So pessimistic around that.
Understandable.
Since we've established the futility of this conversation at all, what are the current best practices for preventing these kinds of incidents?
One of the most important things that we can do is help folks understand broadly what the warning signs are of someone who's on the pathway to commit an act of targeted violence. Here we're looking at identifying and reporting threatening behavior. It is about leakage of their plans, of their direction, of their correspondence with a previous mass shooter or their study of a previous mass shooting incident. Leakage is usually is one of the most important warning signs. I think being able to identify that and then disrupt that behavior or that pathway that they're on. So this takes us to threat assessment teams, as we just spoke about. It takes us to improving access to mental health care, improving mental health services available through employers and through schools. And I know we've talked about that a lot in Minnesota. And then I think training for crisis intervention and grievance mitigation with the folks that are most likely going to have interaction with these individuals when they're on some pathway. That can be their parents. It can be teachers, faculty, and staff, school counselors, law enforcement, mental health professionals, people who care. The earlier that we can identify that someone's in crisis, so to speak, and get them access to mental health care and other guidance that will get them on the right path, and I should say at least off the pathway to violence, those are the most effective solutions. Providing that is the big challenge.
Something that we've been talking about in a couple episodes, both as it pertains to interpersonal violence and suicide, is how important these things are in general. That responsible, targeted, compassionate interventions into the lives of the people who are experiencing the most risk, either behaviorally or environmentally, for these kinds of negative outcomes is going to get us the most bang for our buck. That, like, when you're dealing with a population of people who are largely not the cause of the problem and don't exhibit any warning signs for it, you're not going to do anyone any good at all by addressing it at the population level. If there's any way that we can narrow down the scope of who and what we're dealing with, we should be doing that.
where I think the science is headed here, and this is emphasized in both the Secret Service's targeted school violence report last week and the report from the Violence Project from yesterday, is we're probably moving away from the idea of indicators and risk factors and more towards identifying people who are on a pathway to violence, and that there are different pathways that get them there. And we've talked about some of those things in the course of the discussion here today. But I think sharing that in a way that folks can understand what that means, I think really the media has an obligation to help shape some of this discussion in the public sphere as well by putting some of this detail in context and helping people understand where to go to get resource. And I know they do a pretty good job of that when we're talking about suicide and self-harm, like here's the numbers you can call and places you can go. But we need more of that around, I'm concerned this person's on a pathway to violence. How do we interdict that?
We need some more media stories about people who have, obviously with the consent of everyone involved, but there needs to be some number of success stories.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was, I think it's a great point. There's an article about a year and a half ago in the Star Tribune here in the Twin Cities about my police department, Roseville Police Department, where they shot and killed a guy who was in a mental health crisis a few years ago. And although the shoot was legally justified, the officer that was in command at the scene, the shift sergeant, came out of that and went to his chief and said, I don't feel good about how that happened. And there's got to be something different that we can do in these situations that avoid us having to use lethal means to stop, a threat in that where someone's having a mental health crisis. And they really have they were one of the first departments to go into this whole, mental health crisis response team where they've got counselors and law enforcement and others working together. I think we need more of those kind of stories, but focused on some of the things that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, that's one of the things that bothers me about red flag laws in general, because we're already having a conversation about how limited officer resources and officer training are for dealing and coping with people who are having a mental health crisis. We've already had like a number of fairly high profile tragedies where some family member calls the police because their son or their cousin or what have you is having like a serious schizophrenic episode, and they've got like a screwdriver or something. And when that person needs help, the cops show up and they don't have a whole lot of other options other than to resort to violence to deal with someone who's having a mental health crisis. And we all recognize that as a deep unfairness that's been inflicted on everyone in the circumstance, the family and the officers who are thrust into the circumstance.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how someone can advocate for policies that increase the potential frequency for events like that to occur.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Mass killings dominate the headlines, but does the media coverage affect the frequency or the nature of these incidents?
I don't know if we have any data that shows that, but the Violence Project study that came out yesterday shows that there's been an increase in fame-seeking behavior over the last decade. Actually, I think over the last 5 years is what their data shows, if I don't have it in front of me. And press coverage obviously fuels that. I think the media does this disservice in a couple ways here. They're overly focused on the attacker, although we've seen that, I think, back off in the last couple of years. And I think that's a very welcome step to have that, because we should be focused on the survivors and their stories and the victims and their stories and what we can learn from the incident. But I think where the media faults us the most is just not putting data in context or not questioning the data. And I don't want to smear all media with that. There's some reporters even here locally that do a really good job of climbing into this and being fair and I think accurate in questioning things that they're told from both sides. And that's what I want to see. But not putting data in context it makes it difficult for folks to understand what's really true and what's not.
I think one of the problems is that a lot of news product is sensation heavy. And so far as people have short attention spans, and there's always been the kind of trite, if it bleeds, it leads. But now I think, I don't know the amount of news that I consume that doesn't seem to really know how to do news without sensation. I think they're addicted to outrage at this point. So not only is there fame-seeking behavior in the perpetrators of these events, there's a fame-seeking behavior baked into the provision of news in general. They feed on each other.
If people want to learn more, where can we go for reliable information about this topic?
I should point out, I'm all for unbiased academic study. I want to go where the data tells me. Not all of the studies on this issue are unbiased. Some are funded by gun control groups or funded by gun rights groups, and they have Those studies, I would say, are politically tainted. Here in the Twin Cities, the Violence Project, which is a group that contains faculty from both Hamline University and Metro State University. Hamline is private, Metro State is a public school. This is Dr. Jillian Peterson, and I've forgotten the other researcher's name. They have built a mass shooting database under a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice. They released it yesterday, along with a summary report, and they have an interim report from 2 years ago. I would consider that now probably the go-to place for unbiased factual data on mass shootings. I don't agree with some of their conclusions, and that's okay. Conclusions about, I should say, their recommendations about what should be done, but I do think their data is spot on. Right? They went clear back to 1903. So they got a pretty good summary. I would encourage folks to look at that. The FBI's reports on active shooters, they have two. The phase 1 report covers about 13 years and looks at just the data. The phase 2 report is the pre-attack indicators and was done by their behavioral analysis unit. So think Silence of the Lambs. And then the Secret Service has a number of reports on school violence. You can find them at the Secret Service's website under the National Threat Assessment Center. But their marquee report right now would be their report on targeted school violence that was released last week. I would go there. I wouldn't go, there's some other academic works. These are probably the 3 most interesting places to read. And the data I quoted today all came from one of those 3 sources.
Where can folks find out more about you?
I'm on Twitter at Bryan Strawser with a Y. And that'll take you to, you can find my personal blog, although I don't do much of that, or my professional blog. And we have 2 podcasts we do here. That's Managing Uncertainty, where we go deeper into topics. And we just did a podcast on the Secret Service's school report that came out yesterday. And then on Facebook, if I don't know you personally, I won't accept your friend request, but I do have a professional page, and that's Bryan Strawser, Senior Fellow, Auburn University. And you can find me on LinkedIn and all the other usual places.
Thank you.
That's it for me.
Very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.